Hello boys! Today we are tier listing every single survivor in Dead by Daylight based off the synergy of their teachable perks. Meaning, is it worth getting them so that you can build stronger builds? Or do their perks just work independently of each other? Let's find out! Now, Dwight. Dwight has 3 perks. He has Prove Thyself, Leader, and Bond. Now, Prove Thyself is super strong. Bond is really good for being able to see your teammates, and Leader is good at giving all-around buffs for other players. So, I'm going to go ahead and drop him in a solid A tier. While each of these perks are very useful on their own, they are not the most overpowered in the game. Meg Thomas. Starting off, she has Sprint Burst, arguably the best exhaust perk in the game. Some people say Lithe is the best, some people say Sprint Burst is the best. But the fact that she's paired with not one, but at least 2 super powerful perks, Adrenaline is still one of the single most used perks in the game, so by that margin alone, she's instantly going to be dropped off at S tier. Definitely one of the survivors you want to prestige first. Claudette. Botany Knowledge is pretty good. It gives you a nice little speed boost to healing people. Self-Care is a perk that has a lot of strife. There's a lot of debate over the true usefulness of self-care, especially since the self-healing nerf. Empathy is a pretty decent perk. Being able to see injured allies is nice. However, I would argue that Dwight's Bond is simply better because you can see survivors no matter whether they're injured, healthy, or dying. So for that reason, I want to go ahead and drop Claudette at least below Dwight. I might go ahead and just say she's a B tier because self-care can be good depending on the playstyle you're going for, but a lot of the times it comes as a detriment to other players. However, Botany Knowledge does provide a lot of aid in healing speed. The only shame is that it doesn't work with medkits, so when you could just run a medkit instead of using a perk, it kind of defeats the purpose. Next up, we're going to have Jake Park. He has 3 very nice perks. Saboteur is very good for getting saves on other survivors and is extremely appreciated by random players, especially in solo queue. Following that up, Iron Will has recently gotten rebuffed to making you completely silent while injured, which is beyond underrated, especially since this perk being applied to some of the louder characters, such as Jeff, just throws the killers off entirely. The final perk, Calm Spirit, I'd have to say is a bit of a doozy. This perk has been pissed on and knocked over for years. However, it is becoming slightly more relevant as the devs seem to be introducing killers with perks based around crow interaction. However, for now, I still want to go ahead and say that this perk is absolutely doo-doo. So with 2 good perks and one kind of I want to go ahead and drop him just below Dwight. Next up, we have Nia, who honestly has 1 very solid but situational perk, 1 basically useless perk, and 1 kind of nice perk. Balanced Landing is a nice exhaust perk that killers don't tend to expect, but that's just because Balanced Landing isn't always useful. Depending on the map that you're on, there can be absolutely no changes in elevation, making it impossible to even get this perk to activate. Urban Evasion is kind of a gimmicky perk. There's not too much use for that. It doesn't have a lot of synergy with any other perks, and has a very niche use case scenario. Now, Streetwise, on the other hand, can be very useful depending on the builds that you're going for. Making other teammates' items more effective and last longer can really change the outcome of a game. It can be the difference between 1 flashlight save and 2. It can be the difference between 1 gen and 2. It can be the difference between 1 heal and 2 with a medkit. All in all, pretty solid. I would still have to put her below Claudette just because of the specific use cases where self-care is super helpful and that healing speed can be really helpful. Balanced Landing is just too gimmicky. Urban Evasion is too niche, and Streetwise is pretty mid. So I think B tier is the right spot for her. Next up, the man, the myth, the Bill. Borrowed Time is a pretty nice perk. It used to be considered overpowered or a necessity perk. However, since its effects are mostly base kit now, it is much less effective. Left Behind is a pretty useless perk. There's only like 1 or 2 build situations where it's nice to have, especially if you're carrying a key. Other than that, you can pretty much always hear the hatch or use your general map knowledge to find out where it is. Unbreakable is a make or break perk, which very much can change the outcome of a game. However, if the killer decides not to slug you, then it's completely useless, making it once again a situational perk. Considering he has one good but situational perk, one pretty useless, and one nice perk that became base kit, I'm going to have to go with my gut on this one and place him before Claudette. For the ability for one perk to completely change the tide of a game and flip it around, that alone makes this survivor's perks a viable choice to get prestiged. Next up is David King, the infamous Dead Hard holder. Dead Hard has been a perk in the game for a long time. Most people consider this perk to be make or break. The ability to instantly be able to tank a hit and continue a chase going when you're injured is very useful. However, because of its reputation, killers are very aware of when this perk is being used and how survivors play when they are using it. Due to the inability of using Dead Hard during a survivor's first chase, this perk has become significantly less strong. However, when applied correctly, it does lead to some nasty value. However, it can also be considered a one-trick pony because once you use Dead Hard successfully, the killer is aware that you have it. If they have any brain cells at all, they'll just wait it out next time around. No Mither is the worst perk in the game. This perk will instantly nerf a survivor, making them injured from the start. Sure, they can pick themselves up, but if any killer actually knows what this perk does, that ability is not gonna come in hand. You're most likely gonna get targeted first, downed, hooked, and tunneled out of the game. And finally, we're gonna live forever. A perk that a lot of survivors don't know what to do with. Sometimes this perk can be super useful, and sometimes you don't get any value out of it at all. It only works when you're trying to stop a slugging killer. Now, it is true that picking up a survivor from the dying state twice as fast is very useful, as well as giving them endurance. You don't see a lot of value from this often. However, its potential is noted. Because of the skill level required to use Dead Hard appropriately, as well as the difficulty running No Mither puts on the survivor, I'm going to go ahead and drop David at C tier. Next up is Laurie. Object of Obsession is interesting because it can be used in a lot of different aura reading builds, and it also gives you a small increase to speed while working on generators or healing or many other things. However, it does come with a downside of showing your aura to the killer, which depending on your playstyle can be extremely detrimental. However, when used to its max extent, I think you get more value out of object than you lose value. Decisive Strike is a pretty good anti-tunnel perk. It's nowhere near as powerful as it used to be. Stunning the killer for 4 seconds is barely enough time to make distance to a safe tile. Depending on where you go down, it can be completely useless, except for the fact that it just buys you a couple extra seconds before getting hooked. On top of that, you do have to hit a great skill check, which if you miss, too bad. And it's a one-time use as well. So the fact that you can't use it in between each of your hook stages of being tunneled, it's not as good as some people might think. Soul Survivor is an extremely interesting perk because it actually promotes being the last one alive rather than advancing the game state. However, the extra speed you get to opening an exit gate is pretty insane. It's enough to counter certain perks the killer might run, such as Remember Me. So if it comes down to the end game, you really want to make sure you're getting out. I could definitely see how you can get value from this. However, altogether, I still don't think her perks are nearly as strong as some other survivors, such as Jake. But is she better than David? I would say so. Even with the Decisive Strike nerfs, I still think she's better than David just because you're not injured all game. No Mither is such a detriment for David. Yeah, I would say that her perks are more niche than David's, but they have better synergy with other builds. And for that reason, I think her teachables are just better than David's. Next up, we have Ace Visconti, and I'll make this one real easy for you. Boom. Worst, absolutely worst teachables in the game. They do virtually nothing. One of them makes you get nice little add-ons to an item that you loot from a chest, but looting a chest is just not worth it as it takes up too much time, and you can just load into a game with the perfect item that you would already want. Up the ante boosts your chance of self-unhooking by 3% per dead survivor, which at a most will get you a bonus 9%, which is a total of 13% at unhooking yourself, which you get 3 attempts for, which is better than 4, but still not very good, especially considering since you could only attempt it after everyone else was dead, meaning it would have to be your first hook. And on your first hook, if everyone else is dead, then the game ends automatically anyway. So it's a very gimmicky perk, and until they make luck more applicable in the actual gameplay loop, he's going to remain as the worst survivor teachables in the game. Oh, in case you were wondering, luck does not even apply to the items you pull from a chest.
It only applies to your self-unhooking chance and nothing else. His final perk is kind of decent, increasing the aura range of all your aura reading abilities, but still nowhere near as valuable as any of the other perks on any other survivor. Next up is the most popular survivor in the game, according to the history books, Feng. She is the carrier of life, considered the best exhaust perk in the game, second to Sprint Burst, arguably better than Sprint Burst. It's the same speed boost that you get from Sprint Burst, but activated only when you fast vault a window, making it much easier to control when you use it, rather than Sprint Burst being on a timer cooldown. Alert is a very nice aura reading perk. Whenever the killer breaks anything on the map, damages a generator, breaks a wall, breaks a pallet, any of those times you're going to see their aura for a couple seconds, which is very nice. Technician, however, is not very useful unless you're bad at the game, in which case, good for you. You can get value from this. All it does is make skill check failures quiet for a cost of losing more progress on a gen. So although you are stopping a loud noise notification, you're not getting any statistical value out of working on the gen because you have to commit more time on the gen than you would have just running a perk that makes your gen speed faster. However, considering how valuable Life and Alert are, I'm going to have to go ahead and drop her in A-list, in A tier. And I would go as far to say that Life and Alert alone are better than Prove Thyself and Bond. Next up on the list is going to be Quentin Smith, and this pick is a lot easier to rank because his perks are just not very good. Wake Up is pretty useless. You open the exit gates a little bit faster, but just compared to modern DBD builds, this perk just doesn't have that much value or synergy. The only other perk I can think this would synergize well with is Soul Survivor, which again feeds into the playstyle of assuming you'll make it to the end game and being alive just for a little bit of extra speed at opening the exit gate. Pharmacy's pretty decent. It'll make sure that you get an emergency med kit when you search a chest, but if you're that keen on getting a med kit, you can just run a med kit into the trial, or you could run any other self-healing perk, so you won't even have to spend the time searching a chest to heal yourself. Especially since the medkit self-healing nerf. Medkits are primarily used to heal other survivors, so searching for something that you can use on someone else just is a big waste of time in the grand scheme of the game. Vigil, however, I have to give it props. This perk is actually super good. I would even rank this, honestly, possibly S tier. I've used this perk in a lot of different builds, and the more killer effects that they add into the game, different builds, different perks that inflict broken, exhaust, exposed, anything like that, Vigil's going to help you out with. I'm going to go ahead and place Quentin on B tier, right behind Nia. Vigil being an S tier perk is what's really carrying him here. If not for Vigil, he would be much lower. Next up is Detective Tapp. He actually has some very interesting perks. First up is going to be Tenacity. You're able to crawl and recover at the same time, meaning you can position yourself in the corner of the map while building up your recovery speed, which makes it synergize very well with wiggle builds or self-recover builds, or anti-slugging builds. Aside from that, it's not the most useful thing in the world, but it's definitely nice to have. Stakeout's a nice little perk that synergizes well with certain gen rushing builds. All it really does is give you bonus progression when completing skill checks. While not game-breaking, it is niche enough to fit right in as a perk slot for different builds. And finally, Detective's Hunch. This is a perk that's going to basically operate like a map after a generator is completed, which isn't super useful, but again, nice for niche little builds, especially newer players not sure where everything is located at. Because of his nicheness, I'm actually going to go ahead and drop him right behind David. While yes, David has some drawbacks such as no mither, the nicheness of Tapp's perks are just too specific for builds in order to be useful on their own, making it so that focusing on him as a teachable is just not an optimal strategy. Next up is Kate, and I'm going to make this one real easy for you. She's S tier. Better than Meg. Better than Meg. You know why? Because Windows of Opportunity is the single most powerful perk a survivor can have. Yes, exhaust perks are fantastic and they give you an edge in chases. However, Windows of Opportunity, making every single Volt interaction and pallet opportunity available to you, is just insanely value and honestly cuts the learning curve of this game down to a quarter. If you run Windows of Opportunity, you're going to learn tiles much faster. You're going to know where to run much faster. Even if you're just holding W to the closest yellow highlight, you're going to get more value than not running this perk because you completely mitigate the risk of running in a dead zone. Boil Over is a very nice wiggle perk that gets a lot of value in different wiggle builds, but also is good on its own. If you know how to position yourself on an elevated platform and the killer has to carry you off the platform, then you're gonna get an insane boost of wiggle progression after they fall. As well as just annoying the killer wherever you're picked up from, making it much harder for them to go in a straight direction, the chances of wiggling free are much higher. And the amount of times that I get hooked while at 99 wiggle progression would all be avoided just by running this perk. Dance With Me is definitely her least powerful perk, but being able to hide your scratch marks with a 20-second cooldown is still very useful when so many killers are just following those red marks and not even looking for players. As much as I want to put her above Meg, I'm going to drop her right below because of the statistics on the use of Adrenaline and Sprint Burst. However, they're both very close on the usefulness of their 3 teachable perks, and personally I would recommend going for Kate first over Meg because of windows of opportunity. Next up is Adam Francis. His best perk is definitely going to be Deliverance. Being able to unhook yourself with a guaranteed chance of it being pulled off successfully is just insanely powerful. It completely changes the tide of the game and can give you that extra edge at the end game if you're looking for the hatch. Now, the only time this perk doesn't become useful is if you're unfortunately the first person chased and hooked, which can make it feel like a waste for bringing since you'll get absolutely no value out of that perk slot for the rest of the match. Autodidact is a very interesting healing perk that synergizes well with a lot of the new perks added into the game. So because of its synergy, and although it synergizes well, it still acts pretty well on its own as a perk. And Diversion is just a memey gimmicky perk that can lead to some hilarious moments, fun clips, and sometimes real value. So for those reasons, I'm gonna actually bring Adam right behind Feng and above Dwight. I think that Deliverance is more powerful than Bond. Prove Thyself is definitely Dwight's most powerful perk, but after the recent nerfs, I think that Deliverance still is better, if for no other reason than the self-reliability of knowing you have the perk and how to activate it on your own without needing other survivors. Next up is Jeff. Distortion's really good because it hides your aura, especially with killers running a ton of different aura reading perks. Distortion will help you call out to your teammates what aura reading perks the killer's running, as well as keeping yourself protected. Now that makes it especially useful for Swift games, but when it comes to solo queue, the inability to communicate to your teammates what's going on can be extremely frustrating, even if it keeps yourself alive. Breakdown is pretty useless. You see the killer's aura for a few seconds, and keep a hook broken for 180 seconds, but with so many other hooks nearby at any given time, this perk is just too inconsistent to see any true value from. Aftercare is basically Bond with condition, but without range. At which point I would say just run Bond, because you want to interact with the closer survivors anyway, and getting rid of the necessity to preemptively activate the perk will save you a lot of time and stress. For those reasons, I'm going to drop Jeff right above Detective Tapp, simply for the value of Distortion. So I'm actually going to go ahead and re-tier David because one of his perks is getting reworked in the coming patch, We're Gonna Live Forever, to actually increase the healing speed by an additional 50% and always grant the survivor healed from the dying state endurance, which is pretty insane. So assuming that goes live, with just how many people use Dead Hard, I'm gonna push him up above Quentin. Still B tier, because he's not as good as, well, is he better than Nia? If the changes they made to We're Gonna Live Forever go to the live chapter, then I would even say that he might be better than Nia and Claudette. But for now, I'm just going to put him right above Nia. Next up, we have Jane, a particular favorite of mine. She has some really interesting perks. The most interesting definitely goes to Head On, well known as the biggest meme perk in the game. Successfully using this perk requires the survivor to go out of their way for the majority of the game for specific setups, very much dependent on communication. However, when you get a successful head-on, it's one of the most satisfying and funny moments you can get in the game. Especially with its synergy with other perks such as Flashbang and Quick and Quiet, there's actually more opportunity for this perk than you might realize. Poise is terrible, and Solidarity is good for specific builds because you can actually heal another survivor, and if you're partially healed already, you can fully heal yourself just by healing someone else at a 70% conversion rate.
Pairing that with reactive healing is a common strategy I'm seeing other survivors use, and is really good, honestly. Very underrated. However, due to the situationalness, due to her perks being situational, I'm gonna put her right behind Laurie in C tier. Next up, we have Ashley Williams himself running the perks Flip Flop. Flip Flop has a lot of synergy with wiggle builds. Buckle Up is a recently determined meta perk in certain builds, especially with For the People. And Metal of Man can be utilized to a great deal of advantage, even though it requires a little bit more skill. With that in mind, you can get some insane plays using Buckle Up. So for that alone, I'm going to have to bring him at least up to B tier. His flip-flop goes hand in hand with Unbreakable with Bill, but his 2 other perks are better than Bill's 2 other perks. So just due to the potential of these perks alone and their synergy, I think it's more valuable than Bill's main driving factor, which is Unbreakable. Next up, we have Nancy and Steve. Now, due to the fact that when these characters were removed for the game temporarily, their perks became common perks for everyone playing. Anyone could unlock them automatically, and that still remains true if you had unlocked them during that time. They're automatically going to get some points taken off, since you don't really need to focus them as someone to prestige. But we should still look at their perks with full consideration. Better Together is a good communication perk for solo queue players, helping other survivors find what gen they're going to, although if the survivors are listening pretty well, it's not very necessary. Fixated is a decent perk that works well in tying in tiles and running down expose or exhaust timers. It's very good at helping mitigate your exhaust in different exhaust builds. And Inner Strength is a situational healing perk. Inner Strength is a situational healing perk. It's okay, but it's not great. With that in mind, I'm gonna go ahead and drop Nancy ahead of Ace in D tier. Next, the man himself, Steve. Babysitter, very meh. Although underrated, this perk is still not very good. Seeing the killer's aura is very useful, but that only applies to yourself, while the haste applies to the other survivor who you unhook. So the only situation where that would be kind of nice is if the killer is tunneling and the survivor you unhook gets a little bit more distance and you can see that the killer's tunneling, which still isn't great. Camaraderie is interesting. This is a good way to stop yourself from being left on hook, but it's still very situational because the only time it would activate is if another survivor has come near you intending to go for the save, but for some reason gets chased off hook, which could happen during a face camp, but you're also going to get a face camp meter in that, so there's a lot of conflicting variables when trying to get value from this. And Second Wind. Second Wind, I think, is an extremely underrated healing perk. You get rewarded for something that you should be doing in the game anyway, instead of a side objective like a totem or a chest. And a 20-second heal is very good. The only thing bad about it is it's a bit of a telltale sign to the killer. Even on its own, still a pretty good perk. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and bring Steve above Nancy at D tier. Since his perks, although can be good, none of those perks individually are going to drastically change the outcome of the game. Next up, a personal favorite of mine, Yui. She has the interesting perk Breakout, which is very good for saving builds, helping other people wiggle faster while giving yourself a nice bit of movement speed to make sure you don't get hit, can be very useful. However, with certain wiggle times, and with the chance of killers running Agitation or Iron Grasp, it can be a little tough to pull off. Any Means Necessary is a very fun perk to use, especially for solo queue. It's very nice to see whenever a pallet gets dropped to the ground, and if the killer doesn't break the pallet, it's usually convenient to head to the pallet and pick it up while you're looking for a generator, which leads to recycled loops, which you can keep using for the rest of the game. Lucky Break, an extremely underrated perk that helps survivors sneak away after they're first injured of a chase. Being able to reactivate this perk anytime you heal someone else makes it synergize well with healing builds and saving builds, as well as it synergizing with Iron Will for different sneaky builds. Overall, very solid perk choices from Yui, and although I'm a little biased, I'm personally going to drop her right behind Feng in A tier. Every single one of her teachable perks is a very interesting and unique perk that synergizes well with other builds, even if they don't synergize with each other. I'm going to go ahead and drop Yui right in front of Kate in S tier. If you are a survivor looking for good, fun, strong builds, Yui is an absolute must. The synergy of breakout with saving builds, the synergy with any means with tile recycle, and lucky break synergizing with sneaky builds, as well as working as an independent chase aid, makes Yui's perk potential grossly underestimated. Next up, Zarina. Zarina has two very strong perks and one very gimmick perk. Red Herring is a perk that can be used to lead killers to a generator, although require very specific conditions and action from the killer. It's not reliable, and it doesn't lead to too much value that I have personally experienced. However, For the People is a game-changing perk that can completely change the tide of the trial in just one button, instantly picking up someone on the ground, no matter what health state they are and without any requirement to be met from you other than being healthy prior. Off the record, the single strongest perk in the game in my opinion. It's an insanely strong anti-tunnel perk that lasts for 80 seconds, granting the user endurance, complete aura reading immunity, and complete silence from grunts of pain. So in short, you are undownable, unhearable, and unreadable by the killer. Off the record alone gives Zarina the chance to shine at S tier. The only reason I wouldn't say she's better than Kate's teachables is because Windows of Opportunity works 24/7, whereas Off the Record can only last for 80 seconds after you've been unhooked and not during the endgame. Next up, an old main of mine, Cheryl Mason. Soul Guard is a very niche perk that had a very high potential when it first came out. The endurance value that you get from this perk is way too situational compared to other perks such as We're Gonna Live Forever and Buckle Up, on top of having a time constraint. Blood Pact is an interesting perk that relies on heavy communication but can grant immense benefits to the users, giving them permanent 7% haste as long as you are within range of your teammate. Repressed Alliance is a good counter to certain perks such as Pain Resonance and Pop Goes the Weasel. However, does require a 45-second condition of working on generators and then keeping the generator removed for a full 30 seconds. I think that this perk could be a lot better, a lot like Soul Guard, but Blood Pact is still worth keeping in mind. And for those reasons, I'm going to drop her right in front of Ace on the D tier. Felix. Visionary helps newer survivors discover where gen spawns are much easier, although it doesn't give you any kind of progress buff on the said generator, making it arguably useless compared to Deja Vu, which is a common perk for all survivors that shows the 3 closest generators, i.e. the most important ones to do, while giving you a permanent buff at the repair speed of those generators. Desperate Measures is an underrated perk that balances itself by keeping the buff completely reliant on the total injured, hooked, or dying survivors in the game. Each survivor granting 14% bonus to healing and unhooking means you can heal and unhook people at 56% speed, over half, and at the times when you need it the most. Built to Last is an interesting perk that leads to the reusing of items, especially good for toolbox and gen rushing builds, with lots of synergy. Because of his synergy, Felix can really change the tide of the game when it matters the most. And because of that, I'm going to drop him in the last spot of A tier, just behind Jake. Visionary just holds him back too much for him to be any higher on the tier list. Meow. Elodie. Appraisal, an until recently completely useless perk, now works well in one specific build using the most recent character, Trevor Belmont. Deception is a fun little meme perk that leads to annoying the killers by knocking on lockers and possibly confusing them to search a locker once or twice. This is only really good if you're working with other people that are actually using lockers for head-on value and you just want to throw the killer off more. But after you get 1 or 2 uses out of this in the game, it probably won't work for you anymore. And it's not something you can do in the middle of a chase right in front of the killer. You have to be a little smart with it. Power Struggle is a perk that by existing makes itself useless, because anyone that knows what this perk does is going to avoid walking through pallets when they're carrying a survivor. However, there are very specific build opportunities using Plot Twist and Flip Flop that allow you to have a much higher chance of getting value. Although very memey, I'm still going to have to drop her in D tier behind Cheryl. Next up, we have Yun. Now, she has some very interesting perks. Fast Track is going to be a perk that allows you to do generators much faster, utilizing great skill check bonuses anytime another survivor is hooked. Very useful in gen rushing builds,
Smash Hit, a criminally underrated exhaust perk, although possibly being the hardest to pull off, also requires the least long exhaust cooldown. Smash Hit is a personal favorite perk of mine, so I might be a little biased, but there's no doubt that 150% speed for 4 seconds on a 20-second cooldown is insane. Self-Preservation is a niche little perk that helps you keep silent whenever another survivor gets hit. The only reason you would ever want to run this besides Iron Will is if for some reason you specifically wanted to hide your pools of blood more. Honestly, just run Iron Will. However, with her other 2 very useful perks, I'm going to drop her right behind Adam, but in front of Dwight. Tucked nicely in the middle here on the A tier. Next up, we have Jill. Blast Mine is an insanely fun perk to use that's very easy to get activated during a game. And with lasting 120 seconds, you're basically guaranteed to get the generator done before Blast Mine has a chance to deactivate. Utilizing its synergy with other perks such as Wiretap or Champion of Light, you can have some diabolical moments against killers. One of the most satisfying feelings you can get as a survivor, just behind a successful head-on. Resurgence is criminally underrated. Anytime you have been unhooked, regardless of whether it was yourself or someone else, you will instantly have 70% of your healing completed. This means other survivors are only going to have to heal you for about 3 seconds if they're not using any other healing speed perks or items. This can also be seen as an anti-tunnel perk, because before a killer has a chance to get back to the hook to tunnel a survivor out, you will have already been healed. Encounter Force is a nice hex build counter, although again, very situational. Totem builds are not something you're going to see every single game. Now, with all that in mind, I'm going to drop Jill in A tier, right in front of Jake. Next up is Leon, Bite the Bullet, making healing completely silent, Flashbang, allowing you to basically create a firecracker, and Rookie Spirit, the ability to see all regressing generators and keep track of killer gen regression builds. And keep track of the killer's playstyle during gen regression builds. Really easy for me to tier. I'm going to drop him in B, in front of Nia, but behind David. Flashbang is an insanely useful perk, but it's very difficult to get value from, and is a brand new timing you need to learn. Bite the Bullet synergizes well with self-healing builds and disappearing builds, but Rookie Spirit really holds him behind being any higher. Next up, a community favorite, or the opposite, Mikaela. Now, she's interesting because she was the first survivor to introduce boon perks. Circle of Healing is a very useful perk that allows any survivor at all to see the aura of a survivor that's injured when they're in a particular position, as well as giving them an insane boost to healing. This is great for solo queue because it forces the team to actually communicate with each other just through positioning. Shadow Step helps hide survivors in boons, but it kind of sucks because it just leads the killer to the boon. And Clairvoyance is nice for aura reading potential for newer survivors that don't know where a lot of things are. I'm going to drop her in C tier behind Detective Tapp, because although she doesn't have the biggest synergy, boon builds can sometimes be absolutely game-changing. And aura information is always important, especially for new players. Jonah. Overcome is the easiest to control exhaust perk. You basically run faster whenever you get injured for a very short period of time. Because it's so easy to use, it's nowhere near as powerful as the other exhaust perks. Corrective Action is basically the most useless perk in the game, except for when you're utilizing recent bugs or ignoring the current PTB, where Corrective Action can be used with Hyper Focus for instant unstoppable great skill checks. Exponential is a gimmick perk that allows survivors to pick themselves up. Can be useful, scarcely is. With all that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and drop Jonah in the D tier. His perks may be able to synergize with other builds slightly better than Cheryl Mason's, but his perks still overall kind of suck. Next up is Yoichi. Parental Guidance is very meh. It synergizes well with Smash Hit, assuming you're already injured, because it hides your scratch marks and pools of blood, but it only lasts for 7 seconds, which is just enough time to make a quick getaway, but it feeds into a playstyle that caters to hiding, which is just not something that I particularly enjoy, or think that there are a lot of perks that feed into. Empathetic Connection helps you see other injured survivors and heal them a little faster. This is kind of just a mix of some other perks that we've already gone over. Dark Theory is another boon they added that relies on you running the killer around the boon, although it does give a nice 2% haste status effect, which can go just unnoticed by a lot of killers, leaving potential, but no consistency. I'm going to have to drop Yoichi. I'd put him in D tier,
right in front of Jonah. The aura reading and healing speed is nice. Dark Theory can be used in a variety of boon builds. Parental Guidance also synergizes with some other builds. So next up, we have Haddie. Haddie's pretty difficult to rank. One of her perks is pretty useless. If you spend time doing totems, you'll have a faster repair speed, but this only counts until your next hit. So unless you're playing a really stealthy build and not wanting to interact with the killer, it's basically useless. And even then, if you're going for that playstyle, it's hard to avoid the killer. Residual Manifest is useless. Just bring a flashlight into the trial. You don't need to rummage. You don't need to spend that time. Blinding the killer's only going to hide them from their aura reading abilities, which is not that strong. Inner Focus right now is still kind of bad, but they are buffing it to make the aura reveal double what it is now. Then at that point, this perk might be useful for aura reading builds, which I am very excited to explore. However, until then, I'm going to go ahead. I would say that she is the second worst survivor to unlock for teachables. Next up is Ada. Ada has some really fun perks. So we have Low Profile, that basically keeps you hidden, removes your scratch marks and bloods of grunt and pools of blood. Reactive Healing lets you heal yourself when other people get injured near you. And Wiretap is very, very useful perk to use on top of generators to see killers' auras. It leads to some insanely fun builds and some fun moments. All in all, very solid perk choices. Since Low Profile only works when you're the last survivor remaining, I'm going to go ahead and place her right behind Jill on the A tier. Next up is Rebecca. Better Than New is a good perk to use when you're healing up other people. It gives them a nice little speed bonus, but other players are, it's hard to depend on them, so it doesn't have a whole lot of synergy, except with other healing builds. Reassurance is a fantastic perk that isn't utilized often enough. There are way too many situations where I'm like, if only we had this perk. If you need to distract the killer while you guys push out the last gen if they're camping on a hook, then this is a great option. And Hyperfocus is good for working on gens. All in all, solid. My instinct tells me that she's going to be somewhere in B tier, right behind Claudette. Next up, we have Vittorio. Potential Energy is a very niche perk. It works with a couple different builds and is good for breaking up 3 gens. Fogwise is a decent aura revealing perk. It requires great skill checks. And Quick Gambit is a terrible perk that has been terrible for a long time, however, is another one of those perks that they're reworking to be a map-wide boost to repair progress, which kind of makes it a questionable S-tier perk. I haven't had enough time to experiment with it myself, but I'm very interested in the changes that they're gonna implement. But for now, I think that C tier is going to be a good spot. I'm going to put him right behind Mikaela just because his perks are a lot more niche than hers and a little bit more difficult to use. Next, Thalita. Cut Loose is an interesting perk. It's kind of like Quick and Quiet, except you can use it multiple times if you use it within the same window, but has a larger cooldown. Friendly Competition is a good way to get a small little boost to generator speeds, but honestly, I would just say run Prove Thyself and you're going to get a lot more value out of it. Teamwork Power of 2 is another perk that they're changing at the moment. So right now it's been very underutilized, so the devs want to buff it up a little bit. Instead of being what it is now, they're going to remove the ability to stack the haste, but increase the range that it can stay active, making it 16 meters instead of 12, as well as adding a feature that allows you to keep the speed boost for a small amount of time after leaving the range, which will make it just a little bit better, but still, you're going to need a lot of teamwork, hence the name, in order to keep it useful. Because of the difficulty of getting this to use, as well as just the lackluster benefits from Friendly Competition and select use cases for Cut Loose, I'm going to place her at the top of the D list, right in front of Steve. Next up, the other Lara, Renato! Background Player is an insane perk. It's been insane ever since it was introduced. They've had a couple different nerfs and reworks, but it is still insane. Blood Rush is a very specific use case, but very interesting and has a lot of potential. Collective Stealth is another perk that's getting changed. It's going to have a lot of similar effects it's going to have a lot of similar changes as Power of 2. Increase to the range and the lingering effect. However, his other 2 perks are still just so much better. Renato definitely earns his place in the A tier. I'm going to drop him right behind Ada. I think his perks are more useful than Jake's, especially because of Calm Spirit, but they are a little bit harder to use and a little bit more specific use case as well. Considering Blood Rush only works on your last hook, there's a tight window of opportunity for Renato's perks to shine. Next up is Gabriel, Troubleshooter. Being able to see the killer's aura after throwing a pallet is very nice, as well as seeing a generator. Made for this was a very overpowered perk when it first dropped, but now only gives you the 3% perma haste when you are in deep wounds. Scavenger is a nice perk that I haven't used too much personally, but I have seen it shine in specific build cases. So with that in mind, I think Gabriel gets a solid C tier. Doesn't have a whole lot of synergy, but he definitely has his moments to shine. Now, just a heads up, as we get into the next chapters, the next couple survivors, we're getting into the lot more recent chapters, meaning a lot of their perks are still being used and tested to see what strategies are the most effective. Starting off with Nicolas Cage. Undoubtedly the single most successful survivor chapter in the game. When Nicolas Cage dropped, it blew everyone off their socks. Nobody expected this, and nobody expected his perks to be as good and as fun as they are. Dramaturgy, a personal favorite of mine. The most fun exhaust perk to use, second to maybe head-on, just because of the funny, but is more useful than head-on in an infinite number of ways. You have the chance of getting a completely random item with completely random add-ons, running really fast, screaming for no reason, or being exposed. It is a super, super fun perk to use, and I wish survivors used it a lot more. Scene Partner is a fantastic aura reading perk. It's also really stupid because you'll have times when you look at the killer and you'll just scream 6 or 7 times in a row. It's absolutely ridiculous. But anytime you scream, you actually see the killer's aura slightly longer. Plot Twist, a perk that allows you to down yourself and then pick yourself up at full health with a speed boost. Super fun, great way to change the game. A fantastic self-recovery perk for solo queue gamers. Every single one of his perks are fantastic, making him hands down the easiest to rank S tier. Aside from his fantastic wardrobe and comedic voice lines, every single one of his perks are phenomenal and have insane synergy with other builds. Ellen Ripley, or Rain, depending on which movie you saw. Her perks are very fun. Chemical Trap is a personal favorite of mine. I know I'm saying that a lot, but look, I'm a survivor main. You get what you get. You're able to trap a pallet, which means if the killer breaks it, they slow themselves down, so it forces them to mind game the tile, which if used at the right tiles, will buy you an insane amount of distance and time. And with the recent buff, making the survivor only need to work on 20% of a generator instead of 50, makes this perk utilizable multiple times per game. Light-Footed is a stealth perk that makes your survivor quiet when they're running while healthy, and that only goes on cooldown when you do a rushed action. Underrated perk. And Lucky Star is kind of useless. You jump in a locker and you're a lot quieter. It's good for slipping out of the killer's view, but if you're nowhere else, the killer might be able to determine that you're in the locker and get ya. For all those reasons, I think that she earns herself a solid A tier. And I would say ahead of Renato just because of the more use case scenarios where her perks are viable. Alan Wake. He's got Champion of Light, which slows the killers down when you blind them. Toxic, but insanely fun. Illumination. Keep in mind, when you're in the aura of the boon that you activate with this perk, you will see every single generator on the map, as well as every single chest. So in those indoor maps where things get a little bit tricky, you can't find the last gen, this perk can definitely save your ass. However, I would strongly recommend just using Deja Vu if 3 gens are the specific problem that you're looking to avoid. So, while it's nice and cool, it's not the most effective use of a perk slot. Deadline. Making skill checks appear more often sounds like a terrible thing. However, the penalty for missing skill checks being reduced is a decent compensation, but ideally you want to be hitting these skill checks every time anyway. The only time that this perk specifically becomes useful is when you're pairing it with Autodidact, which makes it really nice because when it pairs with Autodidact, it's insanely strong, but in every other use case, it's lackluster to say the least. Keeping that in mind, I think Alan earns his spot in the B tier, right behind Quentin. Sable Ward, the single most played survivor as of late. Alright, all of her perks have to do with being in the basement. Weaving Spiders is a new type of perk called an Invocation. After completing this big circle thing by just hiding out in the basement, you will be broken for the rest of the game, which means you will be permanently injured, unable to heal. However, you will reduce the maximum required generator charges of all generators by 10, which is, decent. Making all the gens easier to complete is a great trade-off. And if one survivor is able to tank that and force that into their entire playstyle,
It's a huge benefit for the team. Strength and Shadows allows you to heal in the medkit without heal in the basement without a medkit, which is great, and you'll be able to see the killer's aura. So this is a great solo perk. I would choose this over self-care any day. The only trade-off is that you have to be in the basement, and that requires some map knowledge depending on what map you're on. Wicked allows you to always unhook yourself if you're in the basement. We've all had those games where 4 of us are hooked on the basement at the same time against a Bubba or something like that. Maybe it's the end game and the killer's camping your basement hook by shack. This perk will allow you to get yourself out of there and get out the doors easy peasy without any survivor needing to trade. Some of you might ask, why not just use Deliverance? Because unlike Deliverance, you don't need the condition of saving someone prior, meaning this could be the first hook of the game. Is it worth it to only get the buff when you unhook yourself in the basement? By itself, I would say no. However, you have to remember that using Deliverance keeps you broken for a while, meaning you're not able to heal, while as Wicked doesn't do that, and instead shows you the killer's aura for 20 seconds. 20 seconds is a long time. If you come off the hook and you know the killer's far away, pair this with Resurgence or Self-Care, or hell, even her other perk, Strength and Shadows, you'll be able to unhook yourself off the hook, see the killer for 20 seconds, finish your heal at 70% speed, and then see the killer's aura for another 10 seconds. Hold on, did I just come up with an insane build? My point is, her synergy is vast. So for those reasons, I'm going to put her in B tier right above Bill. Because although Unbreakable is an insanely game-changing perk, so is being able to unhook yourself in the basement. So in my mind, they're pretty close in that front, and I just think Sable's other 2 perks are better than Bill's other 2 perks. Aestri, or however you fucking say it. Mirrored Illusion is a funny perk. Being able to set up a false hologram of yourself at a generator or exit gate or chest is super funny, and it's a nice distraction to the killer, but it's not insanely game-changing. Bardic Inspiration is pretty funny by allowing you to play a little guitar. Look at him go. However, I don't think it's as game-changing as some people might lead you to believe. It's completely RNG based, and at best you're going to get 3% bonus to every skill check, which is only going to apply to the skill checks you get and only applies for about 90 seconds. Still Sight, however, is a very interesting perk. When you stand still, you will be able to see the killer's aura as well as all chests and generators within 24 meters. I would say that this by itself is better than Boon Illumination. The only difference between this and Illumination is Illumination requires you to find a totem first as well as bless the totem. However, that'll apply the effect to everyone that is in the range of the boon instead of having to stand still. So they're just slightly differently designed perks, but provide the same similar effect. I think he's a solid C tier. He might have slightly less synergy than Vittorio, but his perks are still super interesting and fun to use. Next up, Lara Croft. Finesse is absolutely insane. Let me put this perk in perspective for you. Back in the day, one of the strongest build combinations a survivor could do was Spine Chill and Resilience. Resilience would give you 9% bonus speed to vaulting, and Spine Chill would give you 4% whenever you were within close enough range of the killer. Spine Chill works slightly different now, so it's a lot less utilized. Together, that would get you 13% bonus speed. 13% to a fast vault while injured was the meta for 2 perk slots. For 1 perk slot, you can vault 20% faster while healthy. This is ridiculous, especially when playing pallets, which I've utilized in multiple recent videos. If you guys have been watching, if not, go check it out. I don't think I need to expand further on this at all. It's just insane. Hardened is very specific to a use case. I like using this perk with Dramaturgy so that when Dramaturgy makes you scream, instead you would see the killer's aura. However, by itself, it is not very great. You have to unlock a chest and cleanse or bless a totem. For most of the time, you're not even guaranteed to scream. The only times you're guaranteed to scream in a regular game is when you get hit or hooked. Both times, the killer's going to be right on you and you have direct line of sight. So unless you're going against Doctor or someone using Infectious Fright, it's not going to be that useful, especially when you need to activate it beforehand. Specialist is a very new and interesting perk that's used to decrease the amount of charges needed to complete a generator. I personally haven't experimented with this too much. I don't
too much cater towards the playstyle of finding and rummaging every chest on the map. However, it's definitely possible to do that now. I would place her right behind Jake in the A tier. Finesse is absolutely insane. Hardened is very use case specific, and Specialist caters to a specific playstyle, but is still pretty decent. And lastly, the most recently added survivor to the game, Trevor Belmont. Eyes of Belmont is a game-changing aura reading perk, allowing survivors to increase the aura reveal time by any other perk by 2 seconds, as well as seeing the killer's aura anytime a generator is completed. Absolutely insane. I can't wait to use this with more aura reading builds. The potential here is just immense, and the synergy is phenomenal. Exaltation also has great synergy because it caters to when you stun the killer, you're going to repair, you're going to upgrade your item, and get charges back, which is fantastic. Moment of Glory is another insanely strong perk, but requires a lot of skill to get it to activate. You have to search 2 chests, and only then, after you become injured, will you automatically heal yourself for 60 seconds. However, if the killer injures you and then injures you again within those 60 seconds, you will just go down, and the amount of time you spent searching those chests will have been for nothing. You will have to reactivate the perk if you wanted to heal you again next chase. High risk, high reward, very well balanced perk in my opinion. With all those facts in mind, I think Trevor has the potential to be an S tier survivor. His synergy is insane. His perks go well with aura reading builds, his perks go well with chase builds, his perks go well with aggressive saving builds. There's just so much potential for synergy there. And there you have it, boys. This is my tier list of every survivor in the game based on whose teachables you should prioritize first in the aspect of synergy. Tell me what you think below. Who did I get wrong? Is there a character that I put too far to the left or too far to the right of another character in the tier list? Or did I place someone in D tier who should have been much, much higher, or vice versa? Please let me know in the comments. I can't wait to do a follow-up on this when they add more survivors and rework more perks. Perks are changing all the time, so new tier lists are always going to be relevant. And until next time, guys, adios.